Hey adventurers, Tony here. This video is going to be a video about, I think I've decided to title it, my adventure through Arthurian literature so far. And so basically it's just what are the Arthurian stories that I have read up to this point and what I thought of them, mostly from a story perspective, not so much from a really deep analytical and looking at what things might be implying and meaning and stuff like that, the deeper meanings of all that stuff. I'm not really looking at that. I'm looking at them purely from a more story perspective. What is the story that's being told and why do I like it, why do I dislike it, whatever it might be. I'll quickly run through the list of what I have read and then I will go through and break them down a little bit more. So the first one I read was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight by J.R.R. Tolkien. Then that was back in May, and then I did a Arthurian literature, or specifically medieval literature, focusing on Arthurian literature class this semester. And so the first book we read for that was Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. This, I've got volume 1 and volume 2 because that's how Penguin Classics breaks them up. I like the breakup of it. It's nice, nice additions. So it doesn't need to be, but that's how I have them. And then we read Tristan with Tristan of Thomas by Gottfried von Strasberg. Gottfried von Strasberg and Thomas are two different authors. They are writing probably what seems to be the same cycle of the Tristan story. And we don't have basically the second half of Gottfried's, or of von Strasberg. We don't have the second half of von Strasberg's and we don't have the first half of Thomas's, so they kind of took the two and smashed them together to give us the complete story, basically, something like along those lines. And then I read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, edited and translated by James Winnie. So this is my second read through of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but this time by a different author. And then the last story that we read was Colwick and Olwen. I don't know how it's pronounced, it's weird. It's an old Arthurian Welsh tale. One of the earliest that we know about, probably. I just have that, I had a PDF of that I just printed off and read it that way, so I don't have an actual physical copy of it really, so I'm not going to be holding that up or anything. Starting with, sure, yeah, let's go do it this way. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, I will kind of talk a little bit about the comparisons between the two. When I read the Tolkien version, I was absolutely blown away with it. One of the comments that I made when making my review for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was that I loved the writing style I loved how you could see Tolkien's writing style coming through and how it influenced the story, but also how well it fit with the story that was being told. I didn't quite understand fully what that meant until I read this Winnie translation that I also really enjoyed. The difference that I saw most obvious in the Winnie translation is that there's several little things that all tie together, but basically the Winnie translation is very, very easy to read, very comprehensible. You don't have to think too hard to be able to understand what's being said. I didn't notice a whole ton of differences story-wise, but the writing style of Winnie versus Tolkien is very drastically different. Tolkien's not an easy writer to read as it is. He's not difficult. He's not terribly hard, but he's not the easiest by any means. But I read the Winnie and noticed several things about it. The way he would translate some words was different than the way that Tolkien would have translated them. Winnie did not keep the alliteration. Tolkien tried to keep the alliteration as close as possible. The rhythm and the meter and the rhyme of the original poem, because this is originally a Middle English poem, Tolkien tried to keep that as much as he could, and Winnie didn't. So there's just several little things that all tie together. To me, I personally really enjoyed the Tolkien version more because I felt like Tolkien's writing style lended very well to the world that was being told about, this magical, mythical world, this otherworldly earth type thing. Tolkien's writing style just fit so well with the atmosphere and describing that atmosphere so well. It just, for me, it worked way better. As purely enjoyment of reading the story, I would read Tolkien again. As trying to, if you want to read it for just the story so that you know what the story is and you can read it quickly, I would say read the Winnie. They're both very good translations. So I have the Old English. So we've got the Old English on one, the Middle English on one side and the modern translation on the other. So I have the entire Middle English version of the original version of the poem. I just haven't really read through it. I did do some comparisons a little bit as I was reading through the Winnie, and I did actually a little bit with the Tolkien as well, comparing the three of them and seeing which one I liked the most, or not liked the most, but which one I felt was the more accurate, and they both seem pretty accurate, just different. And I do like the Tolkien better. I'm not really talking a whole lot about story on this one because I have done a review of the story already, and that I guess I can have linked for you guys. So then on to the Malory. So Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. This story, the title kind of spoils the end of the story. Le Morte d'Arthur is the death of Arthur. So you know from the very beginning that this is going to be the story of the rise and fall of Camelot and the destruction of Arthur and everything that he believed in and held so dear. And so you reading through it, you know from the very beginning this is going to end horribly. This is going to be a tragedy, basically. I really like tragedies. There's some different things about this Le Morte d'Arthur. It's not focused solely on one character or one knight. It's an overarching story telling the story of Camelot. We get a lot of very episodic events. I've heard it described several times. We get one book, so it's split into books with chapters. So we've got book 1, and then book 2, and book 3, etc. Each book focusing on more specific thing. There were several of them that I know these stories. I don't know how I know these stories or where I know them from, but it must just be from my past with Arthurian tales. So I read through it, and I loved the way that it was written. I loved some of the stories. Some of the other stories I didn't love quite so much, but one of my favorite is the Balin and Balan, or Balin and Balin, or whatever. People pronounce it all differently, and I don't know what the correct pronunciation of the names are because I've heard so many different variations now. But that's one of my favorite stories. It's such a sad story. It's another tragedy. There's like tragedies and tragedies within this greater tragedy. It's just, I love it so much, but it's very sad. There's lots, you get to explore lots of characters, spend time with lots of characters. You get to see a lot of Lancelot, which Lancelot has never been my favorite. He's never been my least favorite, but he's never been my favorite. I didn't love how Gawain was portrayed in this. I loved how Gawain is portrayed in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. That characterization of him is one of my favorite characters I've ever read. So I didn't love him as much in Le Morte, but the story itself, telling the tale of Camelot, the rise and fall of Camelot, basically, of Arthur's kingdom, of this mythical city and nation that was just so pure, so strong, so powerful, but then it ended up falling due to people's pride, essentially. People think too much of themselves and they end up causing issues because of that, stuff like that. So there's lots of good things story-wise that I really liked about this story, and I am very excited to continue, because so what Le Morte does is it sets a groundwork for all of the other Arthurian tales. You can basically just plug them into, okay, this would fit somewhere in this time period, this whatever, but it tells so many different stories in the Arthurian legends that you start to understand, okay, this is how this story works, this is the story that they're trying to retell, whatever it might be. You have a baseline understanding because you've read Le Morte, and so that's a very good thing about it too. It was kind of difficult to read at times. It's not my favorite writing style, it's not the most clean, most precise. Tolkien is my favorite writer, favorite author. I love his writing style. But Malory was not horrible, it wasn't my favorite. There was some things that didn't quite work for me perfectly well. And then I read Tristan. So the Tristan tale, and specifically the Tristan character, is a character that I've actually really liked for a long time. Mostly what I remember is the story about Tristan and him killing a dragon and having the chip out of his sword that then exposes him to all these new dangers, essentially. And like, that's this part of the Tristan story that I remember. And it wasn't told in Malory, but it was told in, part of it was told, the chip out of his sword part was told in Malory, but him slaying a dragon wasn't told except in the Tristan. And so I liked seeing that. I loved the Tristan story. It's very much a love story with a tragedy tied to it. Very similar in many ways to Romeo and Juliet. I've never read Romeo and Juliet. I know the story, because it's kind of one of those stories that everybody knows. But there's some similarities. I guess I would say there's Romeo and Juliet has some similarities to Tristan. Love stories have never been my favorite, but the rest of the story that was going on around it, and the tragedy and the intrigue, and there's a lot of stuff in this book that I really did enjoy. We don't get to see a whole lot of, in fact, we don't really get to see any of King Arthur's court. We do see a little bit, mostly just hints that it exists type thing, but we don't really get to explore that within this narrative, which is alright. I would have liked to. It doesn't matter, it's not too bad, but I did enjoy it. Probably not my favorite that I've read. Hey guys, so I forgot when I was filming the video to mention this because I completely forgot that I had done it, but I also have read The Lady of Shalott by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I've heard, and I haven't quite followed up on this yet, but I've heard that The Lady of Shalott by Lorena McKennitt that I had also done is just a later version of the same poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. They're both by Alfred Lord Tennyson, so that's another one that I did. I wanted to include it because it is Arthurian Lit, and it is a story that I really enjoyed and that I did read. So yeah, it was something that I wanted to make sure that I included in this. I definitely really enjoyed it. Within the Morte d'Arthur, it would be the, what's it called? Elaine of Astolat is the story that poem is following and is based on. So I just wanted to make sure that I included that so that I didn't completely forget a major part of the Arthurian Lit that I have done this year and that I've actually made a video on. And then the last story that I read is the Coleg and Olwen, which is the Welsh Tale, one of the very old Arthurian legends that we have, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was so wacky. There was the randomest things. You'd spend the time, the story would spend several pages on the most random things and then blow over some of the things that you'd be like, why isn't this more important? And there's just these things here and there that are completely random, but they make so much sense and they fit so well within the Arthurian canon, I guess, this greater Arthurian legends world, where you have Arthur, who is this king, who's this great warrior, this hero character, and then you have all these quests and trials that the characters have to go through. It reminded me a lot of the trials of, I think it's the 7 Trials of Hercules, something like that. There was a lot of that I was thinking about while reading Coleg and Olwen, and I really enjoyed it. There was, again, some wacky things that happened, like just, oh, let's just kill this character because we can, or let's steal this character's beard with wooden tweezers because that's the only way that it can do it, and then we'll kill the character because we can't kill the character before because the beard will, it's just like random things that don't really work or make sense, but then they just happen and you're like, okay, let's go with it. And so I really like that. Is definitely most people nowadays, because of the way that stories are told nowadays, everything has to be explained, everything has to have a reason why. There's a lot of people who wouldn't be able to reconcile their understanding of modern storytelling with this is just a tale. We're going to tell every single character that's in the court, their name and the thing that they do in their family. And then we're going to tell the next character and the next character and spend 5 pages on just who's in Arthur's court at the moment. And then we'll go on and do this thing. And there's so much that type of stuff that is really unnecessary for the most part in storytelling because we're so used to it being not there, and so we don't need it to be there. But I find it really enjoyable to read sometimes because it's just the randomest things that you'll learn about. Like this guy is a great beard thrower. He can throw his beard this far and do this. It's just like, what does this even mean? But it's so fun, it's so random, and it really fills out and fleshes out the world a lot more. So I loved the story of Coleg and Olwen, and I really loved seeing this entire story that we read because it really all is one storyline. In many ways, it's the mythical story of the British Isles, and it's very, very enjoyable. There's several things that I noticed while reading through it. Things like Merlin disappears very early on in Le Morte. We spend, I think, 2 books with him, which is, it's something like 2 books, but it might be 5 or 4 books. I don't entirely remember exactly how many it is, but we spend very, very little time with him, and his death, because the character never officially dies. His removal from the storyline is so random and so funny. It's just like, how would you let yourself get into this position type thing? And it goes that same type of just the randomness of the Arthurian legends carries throughout all of them, and I really love it, and it's just a very fun thing to see. One of the other things that I noticed in the Tristan especially is there's several references to other stories. I don't even know them all because I haven't read them all, or heard them all told. But there's a reference to Theseus and his return to Athens, white versus black sails, and one of again, it's a tragedy story. The Theseus and Aegeus story is very much a tragedy, and so I love that aspect, but then the reference to it in Tristan was so interesting and so well done. It was like, okay, I very clearly see what you're doing here, and I actually really enjoyed it. There's several of those throughout all the stories. Lots of biblical imagery, lots of just ancient mythology imagery, Battle of Troy, stuff like that. There's a whole lot, I guess it's Trojan War is what it is, but there's a whole lot of stuff like that, and I really enjoy it all and seeing how it all ties together and how it all works. And I'm very excited to continue through this journey, this adventure through Arthurian literature. I think some of the other ones that I am going to read next are the Chrétien de Troyes, I think is the authors, the Arthurian romances. I think Chaucer has some Arthurian tales that I would like to read. There's several others. I've been sent Gawain by, I can't remember the author, I'll have a picture of it up here, but I've been sent Gawain is a young adult retelling, I think, is what it's been marketed as, of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and so I'm very intrigued by that. There's just tons and tons of stories. I'd like to continue reading. I started, but I never continued it. I'd like to continue reading The Once and Future King by T.H. White. I'd like to reread the Black Horses for the King by, I believe, Anne McCaffrey. So there's several stories that I already have available to me that I would like to continue reading, and others that I don't have yet that I will continue compiling and buying myself and getting myself a nice big collection of Arthurian literature just to have for future and for referencing and for understanding the story as a whole that I love so much. So that is currently my journey through Arthurian literature. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun for me to make, just to be able to sit down and talk about my love for Arthurian literature and the stories that I read as a whole. Thank you guys for watching An Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday. We have our social medias linked in the description down below. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay warm.